Hello, and welcome to Ask a Judge with me, Aaron Gauthier, Judge of the 53rd Circuit Court for Sheboygan and Presque Counties in beautiful northern Michigan. For an introduction to this series of videos, please see the first in the playlist called Ask a Judge, where you can comment and ask me questions about the legal system that I'll try to answer. We did have a question and some comments about sentencing decisions. So I wanted to do a video on the factors in felony sentencing decisions. Judges don't make the laws, of course. Their job is to apply them to individual cases in their community. And deciding someone's felony sentence is among the most serious decisions that a judge makes because it involves a person's liberty, the community's standards, and it often involves matters that have impacted or changed people's lives. So this video answers some questions about what goes into deciding someone's sentence in a felony case. Now, we live in a system of government with a separation of powers. The legislature has the authority to establish crimes and penalties for those crimes. A judge's discretion in sentencing is only what is given to that judge by the legislature. So there are some sentences for which there is no discretion. For example, in Michigan, first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Or committing a felony with a gun, if you're convicted of what's called felony firearm, it's a mandatory 2 years in prison consecutive to the underlying offense. No discretion to the judge. But when discretion is given, sentences must remain within the limits of the law. So, for example, we had a question about judicial corporal punishment. That's not allowed. It's not in the statutes. Where a court has discretion, a judge has to consider several factors. There are 4 overall goals for sentencing. Number 1, rehabilitation. Number 2, protection of society. Number 3, punishment. And number 4, deterrence. Now, not all factors receive equal weight in every case. It depends on all the facts. For an addiction-based crime, especially if there's no direct victim, the focus should probably be on rehabilitation and treatment. And this, in turn, keeps the community more safe if the offender is reformed. But for someone who poses a direct danger of harm to others, protection of society may become paramount. Punishment for crime is important for a peaceful society. It's the community's way of expressing its disapproval for criminal behavior. And the punitive aspect of the criminal justice system, it's a substitute for the much uglier tool for society's disapproval, vigilante or mob justice. And then 4th was deterrence, or sending a message to the community that this is not acceptable. Now, it's widely understood in the criminal justice system that the effectiveness of deterrence is very limited. Most people, before they commit a crime, aren't thinking, well, gee, I don't want to do this because I don't want to get in trouble. But it does have some uses. A guardrail doesn't have to prevent every car from going into the ditch to be a good idea. So sentencing does deter some types of behavior for some people. And it's easy to imagine if the laws and sentencing for them sent the message that some types of behavior are winked at entirely. As a community, we would certainly expect to get more of that behavior. So these 4 goals, rehabilitation, protection, punishment, and deterrence, these are not a checklist, but they're a summary of the factors that judges consider when deciding on a proper sentence. So after thinking about those 4 goals, a judge also has to consider the tools in his or her toolbox and decide which are the best ones suited to accomplish the goals in mind. And again, the legislature puts the tools in the toolbox. The judge doesn't do that. The judge gets to pick between those tools. And those tools include the following: probation, where someone's ordered to comply with conditions for a period of time. Those conditions can include things like supervision of the person, a curfew, submitting to searches of their home or person, reporting to a probation officer, submitting to drug and alcohol testing or monitoring. Another tool is community service, which can be ordered through probation or participating in rehabilitation services like substance abuse or mental health counseling, something called CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, which is working with counselors to address the ways that improper thinking leads to improper behavior. It can include job requirements or training, educational components if they haven't completed their high school diploma or GED. Other tools in the toolbox for sentencing include making restitution to the victim, paying fines or other monetary payments, participation in special programming like a drug court or a veterans treatment court or a deferred sentencing program, for example, for youthful or first-time offenders. Other tools in the toolbox include the sex offender registration laws, loss or restriction of driving privileges, and also ordering somebody to serve time, either in a local jail for 12 months or less, or in the state prison, which is for more than a year, anywhere up to life in prison. So in addition to those 4 overall goals and the tools in the toolbox, a judge has to keep one important overall principle in mind, and that is proportionality. The law says a sentence must be proportionate to the seriousness of the circumstances surrounding the offense and the offender. So that proportionality to the offense means that the punishment must fit the crime. Is there a direct victim that was harmed? How culpable or bad was the defendant's intent? For example, if they're convicted of delivering drugs, well, there's all sorts of different degrees of that. So for example, if you were selling cars, if you sold your own car, a used car, you sold it to your neighbor, you're selling a car. If you're a car salesman at a dealership, you're also selling cars. Or if you're the president of General Motors, you're selling cars. But your involvement in selling cars is much different. And it's the same way with some deliveries of drugs. Sometimes it's one addict sharing some drugs with another addict, or it could be a low-level or mid-level drug dealer or somebody higher up in the distribution chain. And as you might expect, we treat those situations more differently. So that's proportionality to the offense, has to fit the crime. The other is proportionality to the offender. The punishment should fit the criminal. It should come as no surprise that repeat offenders often deserve less leniency, and whereas youthful offenders or first-time offenders sometimes deserve greater leniency. Again, it's a balance between the crime and the offender, but proportionality is the standard. So a judge must tailor a sentence to the offense and the offender. One of the ways we do that is by receiving a pre-sentence investigation report. You probably hear judges refer to this as the PSI or the PSIR. This is a confidential document. It's not part of the public court file. It's prepared by the Department of Corrections, probation, and parole officers. And they do an extensive investigation for every felony sentencing into the circumstances of the crime, its impact on the victim, and the life history and present circumstances of the defendant. And so that a judge has all of this information. Now, on top of all of this, the 4 overall goals, the tools in the toolbox, and proportionality, you've probably seen judges refer to sentencing guidelines. I refer to them all the time. In every felony sentencing, a judge has to state that they have considered the sentencing guidelines. And this is the legislature has placed some limits on the discretion of judges. A discussion of the sentencing guidelines goes way beyond the scope of this short video, but suffice it to say it takes into account several variables regarding the seriousness of the crime and the offender's criminal history, and scores them numerically and comes up with a numerical range of months for a court to consider in how long someone should go to jail or prison. I might discuss this in a separate video if there's interest, but there's the sentencing guidelines. So the bottom line, what does a judge do when faced with the decision of how to sentence somebody who's convicted of a felony crime? I hope you see that there's a lot that goes into each and every sentencing decision. Judges have to consider the 4 overall goals of sentencing, must consider the various tools that the legislatures place in their toolbox, must learn about the crime, the victim, and the defendant, consider the sentencing guidelines, numerical score, and range, and then fashion a sentence that is proportionate or fits the crime and the offender. The system isn't perfect, of course. Why is that? Because people are involved. But it's far better than the alternatives. Mob justice, which doesn't carefully consider anything and gets things wrong an awful lot. And it's better than a system of no discretion at all. Those mandatory sentences I mentioned before don't allow a judge to take into account any of the circumstances of the crime or of the offender. That can be too rigid and formulaic for justice to truly be served. So the legislature wisely reserves that for very limited circumstances. So as you watch court proceedings in my court or other courts, I encourage you to think about what sentence you would want imposed in a case if you were the victim of that crime. But also think about what sentence would you want imposed if you were the offender or the offender's family. And then finally, think about what sentence would you impose if you were the judge, having to consider all of those things I've talked about. So that's just an introduction into the many factors that come into play for each and every sentencing decision that judges throughout the state engage in all the time. So I hope that explains some of what you see in court. Remember to subscribe to our channel, Judge Aaron J. Gauthier. Enable notifications if you want to know when we're going live for court. And if you have any questions about the court system, please put them in the comments to my Ask the Judge video, or if they pertain to sentencing issues, go ahead and put them in the comments to this video. So see you in court.